All right, welcome to a new episode of Cali Claptrap. Today I have on Ryan Nakade. Ryan, thank you so much for being on the show.
Hey Matt, thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor to be on Cali Claptrap.
Awesome. So Ryan is a co-host of our political podcast show, Growing Down. I wanted to interview Ryan, return the favor. He interviewed me a long time ago on Talking with Teal. Is Talking with Teal still going, or is it just kind of on the back shelf right now?
Yeah, it's pretty much on the back shelf. I actually started it with a couple friends who I kind of lost touch with, and I don't even remember the
Mm-hmm.
password to get into the account. So yeah, that's that.
There you go. All right, cool. So Ryan, I was hoping to hear a little bit about your backstory, get a little, so our listeners can know a little bit more about you. So, right, I know you said you kind of were raised in a Buddhist temple. Is that accurate?
Yeah, yeah, in on the Big Island of Hawaii.
Okay. Can you just, how is it? I mean, when I envision that, I imagine like this young little monk boy sort of going around. So, can you tell our listeners just a little bit about what it was like within that experience for you?
Sure, sure, yeah. It was my mom is a Zen Soto Zen Buddhist minister, and so my family moved into the temple when I was like, let me think, 11, and I was we
11 months?
11 years old.
Oh, 11 years old.
We moved to
So prior
Hawaii.
to that, what where
Mhm.
so tell me, like, prior to that, where did you grow up?
I lived 5 minutes down the road and
Oh,
was
in
going
Hawaii.
yeah, and was going to that temple, since I was, like, 5, which is when I moved from San Francisco to Hawaii.
Okay.
And so my mom, when the resident minister of the temple left to go back to Japan, she became the minister, and we moved into the temple. And it's not a residential, monastic community, so only my family and I lived there, and then we would just have Sunday services and other community events, but there weren't, like, monks or anything.
Okay. So 11 years old is when did you actually live, like, on the grounds then, at 11?
Yeah, so there's, like, the main temple, and right to the left, like, the house is basically connected to the temple, and so
Okay.
we just lived my family and I just lived in the house.
Um, so when you're on the temple or in the temple, did life change, at all much for you?
You know, the thing that was hard for me was I was a very introverted and shy kid, and it was a very public life. You know, people are
Mhm.
constantly showing up to ring the doorbell and ask for my mom or call. And so that was kind of hard because, you know, when I was a teenager, I was just like, screwed, I don't want to see anyone or have anything to do with anyone. But I was still expected as, you know, preacher's kid, right, to like help out at
Mm.
events and stuff.
Mhm.
But in retrospect, it was really good because there's a lot of really wonderful people who came out of that community, and yeah, and so it was a lot of community support and made some good friends there. So yeah, looking back, it was a huge blessing to grow up there in Hawaii. It's kind of a unique experience, you know.
Yeah, definitely. And that's kind of just what you knew, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I was also I dropped out of high school 1 month in my freshman year, and so I
Mhm.
basically just stayed home from when I was 14 to 16, and just stayed at the temple pretty much all the time.
Why
So
was
I
that?
stopped there. What's that?
Why did you drop out?
You know, I think there are several reasons. One was I went to a really small Waldorf school
Mm.
in middle school, and then transitioning from that school with like 6 kids in my class in 8th grade to a huge public high school in Hawaii where there were tons of fights and like drugs and gangs. I was like pretty
Mm.
traumatized and like pretty sensitive,
Mhm.
and you know, I just didn't fit in well, and had so much anxiety I couldn't really like study or like focus on homework.
Right.
So I basically dropped out and just studied on my own until I did the GED.
Okay. And then sometimes preachers' kids have the reputation of just sort of going the other way as far as what they were actually raised in. Were you pretty was Buddhism always something that, or at least at that age, still something you were immersed in and willing, or were you kind of rebelling against it at that age?
Yeah, that's a good question. I never really totally rebelled because I was always interested in spirituality in general. And you know, I
Mhm.
got into more like new age spirituality and like The Secret and you know,
Mm.
Abraham Hicks and that kind of stuff when I was
Uh-huh.
like 16, and then I got into Ken Wilber when I was 17. And so basically the Buddhist background was pretty easily assimilated into that integral context.
Right.
And so it was never really the center of my life, but it always had a kind of foundational value, right, in terms of
Mm.
meditation and the spiritual practice. So
Mm-hmm.
once I found out about integral, all these things kind of just became pretty easily pieced together. So I never went to a full on like rebelling against it.
Right. So, while I call this podcast Cali Claptrap Integral Conversations, I really don't discuss much with integral unless people have sort of a background in integral. So, at 17 is when you found Wilbur.
Yeah.
And what was your experience like? How did you find Wilbur? And yeah, what was it like when you kind of got into him?
Yeah, so my mom was a regular subscriber to this magazine called Sounds True magazine, I think. And it had like
Mm-hmm.
a lot of Buddhist and spiritual stuff. And so she used to order like tapes and videos just to educate herself. And she ordered was it Brief History of Everything, the audio
Okay.
cassettes, and we were listening to them in the car.
Oh, nice.
Sounded, and this was when I was 15. And we were both
Okay.
he was talking about holons. We were like, what the hell is he talking about? Like this guy is so abstract and like thinks he's so smart. And then for
Uh-huh.
some reason 2 years later it started to kind of click. And
Yeah.
I went on Amazon, and at that time I was working on a dragon fruit farm picking fruits in the sun. And so I used all of my money and ordered every single one of Wilbur's books at once, and it came in a huge box.
Oh my
And I
God.
just started in chronological order from his first books to his latest ones.
Wow.
Yeah,
So,
pretty fun.
did your before I forget, did your mom eventually get into Wilbur, or did she just kind of move on after that one audio cassette and just sort of say, "Yeah, it's not my thing."
Yeah, that but she kind of got into it again because she knew how much I was passionate about integral.
Okay.
But then and so but she never really got into it to the I don't think she's not like the most cognitively powerful person in the world, so
Okay.
it might have been a little over her head.
Yeah. And how is it working on a dragon fruit farm?
Oh, that was fun. That was only for a summer back in 2017, but it was kind of like
Uh-huh.
my first real
What do you
job.
have to do? Climb a ladder and get them down, or what do you do?
So the dragon fruits are they're kind of like cactuses,
Mm-hmm.
and so you have to they're basically cactuses growing on vines on a fence.
Oh,
And so
okay.
you have to stick your arm in and grab the
Ooh.
fruit, and then you have the clippers and you clip it off.
Uh-huh.
And so my arms by the end of the day were like shredded. It was like a cat just like shredded my arms.
Did you didn't have like I know it's hot there, but like any kind of protective gear for your arms?
Oh, I would wear like long sleeve
And uh-huh.
and at
And
the
just hope for
time
the best, huh?
right, exactly. And you know what was funny was at the time I was bald. I actually shaved my head from age like 17 to when I was like 20. I was bald.
Why is that?
Just I don't know. I just needed to change it up. My hair got shorter and shorter. I said, okay, I'm just gonna shave it all off. And so
Uh-huh.
when I was working the farm, I wouldn't wear a hat sometimes, and my entire head became like
Oh my
black
God.
from being sunburned.
So like were you also like going through like a monk phase? Is that also why you were kind of shaving your head?
I think a little bit kind of it was that was kind of my way of like distancing myself from society, like
I see.
as a
Mm-hmm.
symbolic move, and it went well
Mm-hmm.
with the temple scene, right? So
Oh yeah,
it made
totally.
sense.
Yeah. So you got into Wilbur, read all of his books chronologically, and so are you always sort of like a self learner? Is that something that you've always kind of been kind of good at as far as or having an interest, a passion about something, and just kind of going, head first into it?
You know, it's interesting because that only really started when I dropped out of high school.
Mm-hmm.
And when I wasn't like forced to do assignments, I was exploring things I was interested in organically.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's really when that impulse of self-learning really became a big thing for me and a
Yeah.
big part of my life.
Okay. So you read Wilbur. Was there anything that when you read him kind of altered sort of your way of life, in your opinion, or was it just sort of a good sort of study on sort of, you know, his perspectives that he brings to things?
I know I think what was really salient for me at the time was the psychology and the shadow work.
Mm,
And I was really into spirituality and the kind of upper left quadrant, subjective, emotional, psychological work
mm-hmm.
that he talked a lot about in his earlier books, like No Boundary, The Atman Project. And so, yeah, basically from like 17 to 20, 3, I was really only interested in like interior spiritual seeking, and
Right.
I didn't really get interested in the politics and social issues until I was a little older. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so it was really helpful to just the whole idea of shadow work in general was like blowing my mind, and projection. These kind of basic concepts that we talk about,
Right.
and that was really helpful to kind of start cleaning up my psyche. And I think not going to high school did have some detrimental effects on my own development, being really
Mm.
sheltered and really shy. So I
Mm-hmm.
needed some way to work on myself. And that
Mm.
framework was really, really helpful for getting me started on my spiritual explorations.
Mm-hmm. Um, God, I just lost my train of thought. I was thinking of something. So growing up also in Hawaii, Hawaii has such a unique, not even unique, its own culture. Um, how did you find it difficult to? I mean, and then also, I mean, I guess Hawaii in its sense is sort of a melding of both Asian and Western cultures. So,
Mhm.
but Hawaii has its own culture in itself. Did you ever like with the aloha spirit? Did you ever sort of um, bring some of that own culture into your own way of life?
I think, it's one of those things where when you're in it, you don't really know how much it's seeped into you, right? You're like,
Mhm.
but I don't know how wet I am with that water of that
Right.
aloha spirit Hawaiian island mentality. But
Mhm.
after moving to the mainland, right after moving to Oregon, I'm like, oh man, like I really am like a Hawaii guy at heart, just like the way I act and the way that I am. And
Yeah.
the Japanese influence was also very, very strong because my family's Japanese. I was raised with kind of Japanese values, and the community
Mhm.
that I belonged to was largely at the time largely like old Japanese people who
Mm.
who went to the temple their whole life and were kind of like devoted community members. So the Japanese
Mhm.
Hawaiian, I don't know, fusion, island fusion was a big part of my upbringing, and I still think it to this day it serves to really kind of guide how I go about relating to people and thinking about things, and just being kind of laid back and non-confrontational, right? Being very chill, and just yeah, that I didn't realize how much that had influenced me until I got out of that environment.
Yeah. So I know we're going to talk a little bit about race, I think, later on, but how is it being sort of a Japanese descent individual in Hawaii for you? Was there any racism that you experienced?
That's an interesting question because generally speaking, as a kind of sociological generalization, not so much anymore, but for a long time, really since like the 40s and 50s, the Japanese kind of dominated the Hawaiian scene in terms of politics and business and leadership, and being involved in the community. That's definitely declined in the last, I don't know, 50 years, but
Mhm.
there is a kind of let me put it this way: being Japanese in Hawaii is probably a bigger advantage than being white, right? Like
Mhm.
the racism towards the Haoles or white people is definitely stronger than against Asians. But that being said,
Mhm.
one of the Waldorf school I went to, I was pretty much the only non-white person in my class.
Mhm.
And so I did receive kind of like not explicit, but kind of subtly kind of racist remarks. It's not the kids were being malicious, but kids say stupid shit, right?
Yeah.
And then when I went to public school, I did receive racism from some of the Hawaiian kids, but
Mm.
it was that was I got like beat up or like pushed down, and it was explicit. But that to me in retrospect was more not so much that there is a cultural trend of racism towards Hawaiians versus Japanese, but those kids just had issues and wanted to
Yeah.
bully someone,
There
and
you
they
go.
they had like a racist component to it. Like they kind of added that into their personal problem.
Right. So, 20, it said about 17 to 23, you're mostly into upper left stuff, spirituality. What happened sort of around, and how old are you now, just for
I'm 28.
our list? 28. Okay. So around 23, how did you start to branch off a little bit from the upper left spirituality component?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I still remember the definitive moment where it actually struck me, and I was dating a woman and very much in love with a woman who lived in Estonia in Eastern Europe, and I was in
Okay.
Hawaii. And
How did that happen?
oh man, that's a whole backstory. But
That
we met in college,
internet. Oh, okay.
and
College.
and when in actually in Oregon, and then I moved back to Hawaii
Okay.
after graduating. She moved back to Eastern Europe, and it became apparent that it wasn't going to work out. It was long distance. There were
Yeah.
too many obstacles. There's a big age difference between us. So I was like, okay, I was really sad and felt like I was really letting go of a lot of things, like personal things.
Mm-hmm.
I was driving in my car, and I realized that in a kind of in a kind of a epiphany or a flash, that
Mm-hmm.
the kind of guiding archetype that was fueling my spiritual quest was kind of like this archetype of like a yogi or a mystic, right? Someone
Mm-hmm.
very contemplative and inwardly oriented, looking for higher states of consciousness. And all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden, that image just like changed, and
Mm.
it became more of like an outward, external, public, kind of more like Gandhi or like Martin Luther King, right? More like an
Mm-hmm.
activist or something.
Mm.
And I kind of digested that image over the next few weeks and months, and then really started going all in on politics and social issues and trying to catch up, because I was 22 years old and it was a Hawaii down ballot election, and I did not know what the difference was between Democrat and Republican. Like
Mm-hmm.
I literally had no idea, right? So
Yeah.
it was kind of embarrassing because I was so focused in spirituality and religion. I was so politically illiterate. So I just went all in and
Mm-hmm.
just read everything I could, watched tons of YouTube videos, and kind of caught the bug
Yeah.
from there.
Right. So I want to go back to this vision of sort of a sage, like mystic figure. I mean, was this actual like an actual transformative vision that you had, or is it sort of a subtle thing that happened and trickling, sort of over time? Or like when you say you saw this sort of, correct me if I'm wrong there, when you said an image, tell me a little bit more about that transformation, kind of how you saw more of an inward to an outward.
Yeah, it was kind of like what Jungians would call active imagination.
Okay.
So it wasn't like a transpersonal experience, but more just like a
Right.
deep. It was kind of like a inner a depiction or
I see.
representation of like a inner shift that was happening.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. And then so yeah, I mean, to kind of catch, I mean, so from that point on, your journey has sort of been, what would you say, from
Uh,
23 on
yeah.
up until today? Like how do you describe the last 5 years and what your purpose has been? What's your driving force?
Oh yeah, yeah. Great question. Yeah. So it's kind of changed a little bit as I've had different jobs and stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
generally it's basically trying to learn as much about the world as I can.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, really in the last 2 years, it's really crystallized around mediation, conflict resolution, communication, and my passion for trying to depolarize society and kind of oscillating between more explicit forms of political activism where it's like, yeah, this is what I believe in, this is what I think is good for society, this is the direction I think we need to go, these are the candidates I think we need to support, and then taking a step back from that and saying, well, let's listen to what you have to say, right? Doing more mediational work, being a little bit more neutral, focusing more on how the relationship or interaction takes place rather than what's being said. And so that's kind of been kind of my oscillation, right? Is being very passionate about politics, wanting to get involved, and then also doing mediation outside of politics. But obviously now it always ends up including politics, right? Because that's such a huge
Mm-hmm.
issue in our country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And before we kind of get into politics and that specific part of it, so what motivated you to move to Oregon?
Well, I met my girlfriend in 2015 in October, and she lived an
Hmm.
hour and a half away from me on the very northern tip of Hawaii. So the
Uh-huh.
commute was really obnoxious, and we were
Yeah.
both kind of looking to leave because the town she lived in had like 1,000 people, and I was ready
Yeah.
to go off and grow up and do the whole adult thing. So she got a
Hmm.
job in Portland at a
Okay.
homeless nonprofit called Sisters of the Road, and
Okay.
we're like, okay, so we just got on the plane and packed our bags and left.
And for again, I know what you do, but for how did you kind of raise goats right now, correct?
Yeah, yeah, we have 6 Nigerian dwarf goats. They're the love of our life,
Uh-huh.
our
And
therapy animals.
and how did you get into that?
So it turns out we moved from Southeast Portland to Gresham, which is just east of Portland, pretty much in the country. I mean, this is pretty much considered to be the countryside where we live.
Hmm.
Uh, February of 2018. and our landlord was interested in getting goats for like milk. And
Okay.
so my girlfriend looked into it, and we found someone in Washington with some goats. So we got 2 goats, and then we started breeding them, and it became a whole lifestyle.
So would you call yourself a goat herder, or is that something different?
I associate that with being a little bit more like large, like serious. They're kind of more like, I mean, we do milk them all the time, but they're in the way they're also kind
Yeah.
of like pets. They're mostly for fun, but the milk is a nice bonus.
Uh-huh. And I'm just curious about, is it a lot of work to take care of goats?
I mean, it's actually not. It's not too bad because they're pretty independent as long as they're with the herd. So you
Mm.
do have to do stuff like mucking out the barn, which can be a pain, but
Mm-hmm.
the bill adds up for all the food and expenses. But once you have your
Okay.
setup, it's actually not too bad. I always say they're kind of a nice balance between like a dog and a cat. Like they're not as
Mm-hmm.
aloof as cats, but they're not as like in your face as a dog. They'll
Got it.
come and they want to be petted and play with you, but then they'll go off and eat, and then they'll come back, and yeah, it's nice,
Okay, cool.
nice rhythm.
Yeah. So now I'm assuming you kind of are, you kind of know the difference between Democrats and Republicans. And I know on our show you described yourself as a political animal. So what really drives you to be interested in politics for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's several things, right? I think there are different ways you can look at it. So I think on one level, I just have a passion for it that I can't really explain, and I can rationalize the passion. So
Mm-hmm.
I would say that it's obviously it's a huge problem in our country, right? Not only the actual policies that are being passed, but also the entire toxic public discourse and how much it influences everything else. And so generally as a acupuncture point or social change lever to pull on, that's kind of like my go-to, right? Other people have like sustainable agriculture, or
Mm-hmm.
they would have, they're interested in things like environmentalism, or everyone has their own social change angle, and mine is just politics because that influences everything else. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like the problem can be the solution. And if politics is really, as Brent was saying, right, the politics is kind of the heart of the meta crisis, then if we can go to the heart of that and have that see, have good politics, good sense making around policy, more nuance, more substantive analysis, and so forth, will hopefully bleed into how we think about everything else, since it is interconnected with everything else. So that's kind of like
Mm.
my go-to point for trying to create social transformation in a more
Yeah.
healthy, more integrative direction.
How do you define politics?
That's a good question, because people talk about the distinction between politics and policy, right? So policy
Mm-hmm.
are the laws that are passed, that of a governing body, right, that inform how a society does things. Politics is the process, all of the campaigning, debating, everything, the messaging, the signaling, the discourse in general, the process that gets you to create policy. And that's where I actually think a lot of the leverage can happen, because of how much we outsource our own sense making to politicians and pundits who, for various reasons, have some pretty bad takes on things. So I think that if
Mm-hmm.
we can, with our podcast, for example, I'm trying to give a more integrative take, trying to give a more holistic take, can help to cut through some of that noise and help improve people's thinking and communicating about such a divisive topic.
Yeah. And so I, correct me if I misrepresent you here. At least in my eyes, you seem to really be, you kind of immerse yourself in sort of, let's just, you consider yourself more on the left side of the spectrum, but you really immerse yourself sort of with the right side of the spectrum by going into like Proud Boy groups and other things like that. What motivates you to kind of reach across the aisle?
Sure. So this is kind of become a weird like pastime of mine, and
Hmm.
I would say several things. Right. One is I think it's just good to be able to understand the other side's point of view, especially the other side's critique of your side. There is kind of a strategic component, putting on my very Machiavellian hat, right, of knowing what your enemy thinks, right? There is kind of
Hmm.
that component. The other component too is it's just fun for me to talk to someone who has such a different perspective on things. It's almost kind of like taking a psychedelic drug. It's like,
Hmm.
whoa, I never thought of it that way. That just turned my whole world upside down. And to me, there's
Yeah.
something about that, that's to have my frame challenged or broken in that way is kind of like a thrill. It's almost like
Mm-hmm.
thrill seeking in a way.
Yeah.
My
Mm-hmm.
adrenaline, I started getting excited, and it's kind of exciting, right? And I'd say the third thing too is that a lot of these groups that I've infiltrated or have studied up on, I think are, left, right, center, whatever. I think a lot of them are manifesting their values in a very unhealthy way, but that's
Mm-hmm.
not completely their fault, right? I think it's because they
Yeah.
feel attacked, they feel like society doesn't acknowledge them, and so it's kind of like a shadow. And so I'm really
Yeah.
trying to find out what are the core values and needs and identities that they have that are expressing themselves pathologically, and
Mm-hmm.
how can I integrate them or include them, and include and um, by integrating that, maybe giving them a healthier alternative to what they're advocating for, or at least change the way and how they're advocating for it. And we may
Mm-hmm.
always have disagreements, but if they can advocate for their position in a way that's not as polarizing and divisive, I'm all for
Yeah.
that in a democracy,
Yeah.
right?
Do you think you're attempting to convert them, and do they get the sense that you're attempting to convert them?
I certainly hope not. I haven't heard that feedback.
Yeah.
My intention is not to convert them. And I always say that one of the paradoxes of changing people's minds is if you really want to change someone's mind, you have to let go of changing their mind, because
Mm-hmm.
people can sense that you have an agenda. They feel attacked, and so letting go of that and just being genuinely curious and open-minded, it seems to go a really long way, especially today. And I'm also there genuinely trying to learn and integrate insights from them that could improve my life and my thinking about politics in general, right? So they may
What
have a
have
real.
you learned?
Oh, sure. I mean, any tribe you want to mention. I mean, I think with the libertarianism, right? There are so many different kinds of justifications for limited government. One guy that I talked to is a Christian libertarian, and for him, actually, limited government and personal autonomy is actually kind of like a sacred spiritual experience, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
being able to live independently of government telling me what to do and making my own choices is actually kind of like there's something sacred about individualism. Other people are more interested in economic practical arguments about how government interference screws up the economy, and laissez-faire markets can solve certain problems better than government. And for me,
Mm-hmm.
it's really looking at things on a case by case basis, and
Yeah.
weighing the options and weighing the pros and the cons. And sometimes any side, let's say for economics, right, there could be a con for a policy that I'm for that I was simply not aware of. And once I take that into consideration, maybe we can design an even better policy that you get more benefits and less drawbacks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of, so there's kind of like a practical, being educated in a practical sense, and then there's also just resonating with what people's values are and how they feel like their values are not being actuated in society, right? They feel like their values are being made fun of or suppressed in some way. And so
Mm-hmm.
so being able to appreciate different values that I tend to not think about or really identify with, and trying to integrate into my own life. Example would be something like, I don't know what you're a dad, and so you probably have
Mm-hmm.
more or less some kind of a conscious or intuitive parenting philosophy. And parenting is
Yeah.
thing where there's a huge range of like just kind of like conservative traditional parenting, like being really strict on the kids, and
Mm-hmm.
then there's more like the liberal parenting of,
Right.
so I'm not a dad, but just like understanding the conservative arguments for parenting. It's like, oh yeah, I can see how you could think that's important to raise your kids in a certain way that you feel like parents in Portland are kind of like spoiling their kids or whatever, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, just thinking about it in that kind of subjective sense too.
And do you eventually want to get into politics yourself?
I'm not really sure. I think my passion is I just love talking to people. I think
Mm-hmm.
I would have more fun campaigning than actually winning and governing. That's kind of my dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I just love talking to people, and there is something about really being listened to by someone who's in a formal position of power or in charge, right? It's kind of like
Mm-hmm.
if I'm just a nobody podcaster who's being compassionate and listening to people, that can have an impact. They can feel appreciated and heard, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you are someone who's actually really in a powerful position, and then you listen to someone, it can be even more special or even more transformative, right? And that's kind of my passion, is how can I use that, if I was able to become an elected official, how can I use that to really deepen my relationship with people? But when it comes to really developing um, policies that are very well designed, that's something where I have less confidence in terms of what would really work the best. There are a lot of gray
Mm-hmm.
area issues where I'm like, I'm still researching them and I don't have a conclusive, conclusion. So
Right.
I'm less confident about that part of it.
Okay. So kind of branch off a little bit from there. I met you on Integral Life, and you invited me into your inner circle of doing the Zoom calls, which I really appreciate. But you also, I think, looking back, also have a criticism of sort of the integral sort of main community. I was hoping maybe we could talk a little bit about that. So you kind of talked about kind of getting into WIlber at 17, and then what is your reflection now looking back on sort of that time in your life, and also what you know about WIlber and integral now? Do you think his influence is still I don't want to say powerful, but is it still sort of important to you as far as how you go about doing what you're doing now with sort of politics and talking to other people?
Yeah, I would say it definitely is. I think it's one of those things, kind of like my cultural upbringing, where I've internalized it at such a deep level that I don't really think consciously about it. But when it comes to
Yeah.
like, oh, lower right quadrant, lower left quadrant, talking about developmental stages, it's become so internalized and so natural in a sense that I don't think
Hmm.
consciously about it or really have an interest in reading more about it. And so I'm kind of, right now I'm in a phase of trying to learn other things that I haven't studied before
Yeah.
and integrating that. But I think, how much, whether we agree or disagree on the exact nuts and bolts, the content of Aquil or integral theory, I think that beneath it, the genuine impulse for wholeness, integration, evolution is always going to be pretty core to who I am. And
Hmm.
so that, in that sense, me and WIlber are 100% aligned, right? Like that,
Hmm.
and we may have a different idea of how that's expressed, right? But I think the underlying impulse is always going to be resonant with me.
Okay. And do you still, I'm assuming when you were living at the temple and practicing Buddhism, were you a regular meditator?
I went through phases of meditating regularly.
Hmm. So how about, do you continue that practice, or is that not something you continue to do?
I I I meditate off and on. I would say
Hmm.
that in terms of the general exercise of just looking at myself and blind spots and letting go of things, that
Hmm.
happens like every day, every moment, right? In
Yeah.
terms of actually sitting down and closing my eyes and stuff, I'd say I meditate maybe like 3 times a week.
Okay.
And then I do yoga every day, and I also
Okay.
play music, like
Oh, nice.
spiritual music once in a while too.
And spirit, what do you on your guitars there? What do you play spiritual music on?
Do you know what a harmonium is?
Is that the I know you and Luana were talking about what is that, you showed that picture from the past? Is that something you remember what that was? Like, it was this kind of really exotic looking instrument, and you posted a picture from the past, and it was kind of like almost like Hindu like
Mhm.
kind of music, but I couldn't. Is that what a harmonium is? Or I have no idea what a harmonium is.
That is what a harmonium is. So it's
Okay.
basically like a mini piano that you pump like an
Hmm.
accordion,
Okay, right.
and it has a very nice resonant sound. You can pack it up in the box and transport it.
Yeah.
And so that's something I learned in college. It's called like kirtan or singing bhajans. It's kind
Okay,
of like
there it
Hindu
is.
devotional songs like Krishna Das and stuff. So I still do that when I'm in the mood, like maybe like once a week.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
So just kind of, where do you see what's in your future? Where do you want to go? What are you hoping to learn more about? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think about it all the time. I think that the general directions are definitely, politics, as we talked about, mediation, conflict resolution, but
Hmm.
specifically applied to like race and issues of race, and also depolarization, political depolarization. And I
Hmm.
kind of go to those two things partly because I do have a lot of genuine interest in those two subjects, but also because they're such a huge contributor of all the divisiveness and craziness out there, that if
Yeah.
I can try to lead the way in having a more coherent understanding and discourse around those subjects, around race and politics in general, right, then I think we can, as a society, take a step in the right direction to get us out of this mess that we're in. Um, so that's kind of what I've been developing.
And what is your advice to others on how to accomplish that?
Hmm. Um, in regards to,
How would you, I mean, to generally people that are listening to this, as far as, obviously there is a hyperpolarization going on right now in our country, maybe even in the world. And we seem to be at a very crucial time of something happening. And, through all the work you've been doing, I was wondering if you have a general prescription that you kind of advertise or have found for yourself, or if people were open-minded to listening to sort of how how a person can influence our culture to participate in this depolarization. I was just wondering if you have sort of a recommended advice or prescription that you would recommend to others.
sure, I have a whole list of stuff. I mean, so basically, when it comes to depolarization, I really break it down to four components, which are based on the quadrants. Actually, kind of coincidentally, I came up with the four foundations of Ryan's depolarization. I said, "Oh my God, that's the quadrant. See, this is the internalization of the Wilber thing so deeply, right?" So, it's depolarize our minds, depolarize our brains, depolarize our relationships, and depolarize our systems.
Hmm.
And so I start with the upper left quadrant and depolarizing ourselves, depolarizing our minds, and going into different techniques that we can do in ourselves. I call it like political shadow work. There's Ezra Klein, the found, I think he's like a writer at Vox or founder of Vox. He talks about something called identity mindfulness, where
Hmm.
you become aware, you use mindfulness and meditation to become aware of when your identity or core values are being triggered in a political
Hmm.
conversation.
Hmm.
Even just clarifying what our core values are behind the policy positions that we're advocating for. And another technique I love to talk about is called Darwin's Journal. And basically, there's a story about Charles Darwin when he was coming up with his groundbreaking, theory of evolution, where he kept a separate journal to write down everything that contradicted his thesis.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like a way to fight back against confirmation bias, which is one of the
Hmm.
deepest biases that we have as human beings, and other kinds of biases we have too. So different kind of bias work, and developing more self-awareness around how we relate to politics in general, right? Another one I talk
Hmm.
about is called the Epistemic Trail, which is thinking about what you believe and really interrogating, why do you believe that? What were the studies that you saw? What were your life experiences? What were your biases? What was your reasoning process that led you to a certain conclusion? And then the next part is, and of course, you can apply all these techniques. When you apply them to yourself, it has obviously a neurological and physiological effect. And you get into like polyvagal theory, trauma, the way that um, the brain responds when feeling threatened, like amygdala hijack and the reptilian brain, that kind of thing, right? It's kind of a nice visual for people. Then
Hmm.
once you apply that to yourself, you can start to apply those in difficult conversations where you're having a political disagreement with someone. And I go through different kind of communication techniques that are helpful for that. One is called spectruming, and what that technique is, people tend to break reality into black and white chunks, right? So we have the people and the elites, we have the left and the right. And so basically spectruming is a way of turning that into a gray area. So you really say
Hmm.
like, okay, so we have the people and the elites. What does someone have to do in order to be considered an elite? And what would be someone at the borderline? So you're developing more nuance between these hard divisions.
Hmm.
What would make someone a conservative? What happens if they're liberal on this position, but they're conservative on this, right? And really getting
Hmm.
into those nuances, trying to create gray areas. Another one is just exploring, what are some areas of uncertainty or internal values contradiction you have in yourself, and kind of explicitly exploring areas of uncertainty. And how do you deal with uncertainty? How do you work with a situation where you don't really know, you're not totally confident if a certain idea would be good for society or not, right? How do you deal with that doubt? Another question like it's called the anomaly question, which is, do you have any disagreements with people in your same subculture, mimetic tribe, right? And that kind of gets
Mm-hmm.
people to think originally, and so it kind of cuts through the tendency for groupthink and tribalism. So there are different communication things. Obviously, the basic ones, listening, paraphrasing, trying to uncover what their core needs, values, and identities are, and building. Another one I talk about too is called many bridges to common ground. And so
Okay.
there's like the what and the how, right? It's not what you said, it's how you said it. So you can always find, usually almost always find some common ground with someone, if not on what they said, how they said it. Kind of like how I was talking about Wilbur. I may not agree with all of the specifics of Aquil or the way that he writes, but the underlying impulse of that integral impulse to wholeness and evolution and integration, I completely resonate with. Or you could do the reverse and say, I may not agree with how you said it, but I do think you're factually correct, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
there's different ways you can create common ground when it seems like there isn't any. So that's just a few
Yeah.
of the interpersonal techniques. And then finally, with the systems, just be developing more awareness and literacy of what is the systemic factors that contribute to polarization, right? We can talk about the race to the bottom of the brainstem, the outrage economy perpetuated by mainstream media and social media. We can talk about the two-party duopoly. We can talk about money and politics. Income inequality correlates with increased polarization. And then once you become more aware of these systems, Facebook and social media algorithms, right? You can then be more aware of when those systems are influencing us negatively, and also then tweak some of the algorithms, let's say, of social media, right? Like what I do is I subscribe to a whole bunch of like right-wing people just to get a balance of information, so I'm not
Uh-huh.
becoming cocooned in my own little bubble. So you can mess with
Mm-hmm.
the algorithms in that way and fight back
Right.
in your own way against the system.
Yeah. So speaking of the anomaly one and your own mimetic tribe and stuff, what do you find sort of for first of all, what mimetic tribe do you identify with, and how do you also find the anomalies within that for yourself?
That's a great question. It's I'd be curious to hear your answer for yourself, because it's kind of tricky on a policy level. It's like, well, I'm pretty strongly in the progressive Bernie AOC, Andrew Yang, Tulsi Marianne
Yeah.
Williamson, anti-establishment, populist progressive left policy.
Mm-hmm.
But culturally, I don't totally resonate with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would say culturally, I'm kind of mixed and all over the place. Obviously, I resonate with the integral meta modern stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's interesting. I think when it comes to thinking about my own maybe disagreements or my own differences I have with some of my fellow tribe members, so to speak, right? I think
Yeah.
that's really where me studying the literature from sides that I disagree with is that's where that's important, because if I
Right.
don't encounter different perspectives, I may not even know they exist.
Right.
Yeah. So doing
Um,
that gives me more self-awareness to, you know, yeah, have
yeah.
a more
Yeah.
well-rounded perspective.
So we've done the Growing Down podcast now, I think, for I don't know, seven-ish months. I can't remember.
Wow.
Um, what do you think? What has been the most and not really an insightful experience, but looking back, reflecting on that, what stands out for you as far as um, either learning or getting from the experience?
Well, first of all, it's just been a pleasure to do it with you guys, you and
Yeah.
Jeremy. That's been it's
Mm-hmm.
been. I mean, honestly, that's kind of the main fun for me behind it. It's just it's an opportunity to hang out with my friends on a Saturday morning and shoot the shit about different subjects.
Right.
And it's a great bonding experience. And it's been a pleasure to get to know you guys in that way. I
Definitely.
think each of the guests has given me something to chew on. I often rewatch a lot of the interviews,
Mm,
and
good.
and continue to. It's amazing how much I miss during the actual interview. Maybe I'm thinking about my
Yeah.
own question, or I'm focusing on other things happening, so I have to rewatch it. And yeah, just being in that whole podcasting world is just interesting
Yeah. Definitely.
experience.
Definitely. Um, So I know just a couple final things. I know something that stands out for me is something we've talked a little bit about the left and socialism, and a little bit about your own thought. What are your thoughts on capitalism?
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day actually. I think this is kind of where I've arrived. I think I think the original term capitalism, right, if I understand
Mm-hmm.
correctly, was actually coined in a derogatory way to talk
Mm.
about in the unhealthy aspects of a free market economy, or at least
Mm-hmm.
a market economic system that has private ownership. From a Marxist perspective, we can say private ownership of the means of production. And
Yeah.
really, I think the word that I've been using to describe our warped and bloated form of capitalism today is, people call it cronyism. I think it's really
Mm-hmm.
like shareholderism, where it's really the
Mm.
shareholders are the people that have all the power and control everything else from a top-down perspective, right? Because the shareholders of a company control the board. The board
Mm.
determines who is hired as a CEO, and the CEO then determines everything, within the company, along with like the HR department in terms of hiring, firing, and the direction of the company in general. And he has to report to the board, and is ultimately tied to the shareholders' interests. And so we have a very top-down, very hierarchical setup that definitely doesn't have the workers' best interest at heart. And this is where we get
Mm-hmm.
into Marx's critique of the extractive nature of capitalism, right? As surplus value being extracted from the gap between worker production and maximizing profit that's driven by the shareholders. And so I think that I'm not a total anti-capitalist in the sense that, according to the research that I've seen, I think there's a lot of arguments for a free market system working very well in certain instances.
Mm-hmm.
My disagreement with libertarians or anarcho-capitalists is they think it works well in every instance, and I think no,
Right.
because it creates either externalities that damage the commons, or it creates a moral dilemma where you have perverse incentives like private prisons, for example, or it
Yeah.
hurts the person voluntarily engaging, which is why we have laws against child pornography, right? So there are a lot of things
Mm-hmm.
that the free market does not work for. But I think that I am for a mixed economy, right? Like the Nordic model. I'm
Mm-hmm.
pro welfare state and lifelines for people. And also I think that the free market, we do need to respect the things the free market does do well, and also consider abstract principles of the free market that are ostensibly only tied to the free market, and design systems that transcend and include those beneficial elements. So one example would be competition spurs innovation, right? But competition can also create a race to the bottom zero sum game that damages the environment and the commons. And so how can we have a system, a kind of a game B kind of system that still encourages and incentivizes innovation, but not necessarily through destructive forms of competition, right? So we can start to abstract, you know, key nuggets or good things about a free market system, and then build them into whatever other system we're creating that will be better because it doesn't have the drawbacks.
Awesome. Beautiful answer. And final question. So when we sort of adopted the Discord group and created that, we all sort of also adopted sort of a persona or an archetype of the Avengers. And I was reading this week that Captain America was created to defeat fascists. And for our listeners, Ryan is our self-appointed Captain America. And I'm not going to ask you to bust out the outfit, the costume today for Cap, but does Cap have any final words to our listeners?
So that's interesting. So basically, you just said that Captain America was the OG Antifa.
Yes.
That's funny. Oh man. Yeah, oh, and by the way, I think that once the Shang-Chi and the Ten Rings movie comes out,
Mm.
I'll have to switch my persona to that. But
I think it's interesting. I think Marvel should look into having an Asian Captain America. I think Marvel, if you're listening to this, go ahead and bookmark that and think about it. All right, go ahead.
there we go. Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, well, thank you, Matt. This has really been a pleasure to do this. And my inspiration behind the Captain America archetype was that he's a human, right? He's not really like totally overpowered in terms of his superpowers, but he has a kind of virtue and integrity that he embodies. And that's his real role on the Avengers, is a kind of moral leadership, right? He's not the
Mm-hmm.
strongest guy, he's not the smartest guy, but he's kind of the spirit of the team. And that's something I
He can
really,
lift Thor's hammer.
yeah, because he's so pure of heart and pure of character. So
Yes.
that's something I admire and try to live up to myself on a daily basis. So he's basically kind of like my equivalent of like Jesus Christ.
Uh-huh. Definitely. Well, Ryan, thank you so much. I'm going to post in the description where people can find you. As always, it's a pleasure, and thanks so much for being on my show.
Thank you so much, Matt. It was a pleasure, and we'll see you on election night.
Awesome. Sounds good.